No one ever warned Honoria Ashworth that one quiet choice could tear her life apart and stitch it back together into something unrecognizable. If they had, she might still have opened her door that night. Kindness was as natural to her as breathing, and she had never learned how to measure its cost. Years later, she would still think of a torn coat, a length of silk thread, and a storm so loud it felt like the sky itself was breaking. Those simple things became the beginning of everything. Honoria was 24 and lived alone in a small cottage on the edge of a lonely country road. The house had belonged to her parents, and every beam and stone still carried their memory. Ivy climbed the walls in summer, and a narrow garden stretched behind the kitchen, where herbs and vegetables grew, in stubborn rows. It was not much, but it was hers. Her parents had died of consumption within weeks of each other during a bitter winter, leaving her with grief, a small savings, and the skill her mother had pressed into her hands from childhood. Sewing had kept her alive when nothing else would. She earned her living as a seamstress. Her stitches were neat and invisible, her hands steady, her mouth quiet. People trusted her because she never spoke of what she saw or fixed. Wives brought her torn gowns. Husbands brought worn coats. She listened, nodded, and worked. In a world that liked women silent, Honoria had learned how to turn silence into strength. Her days followed a simple pattern: work in the morning, errands in the afternoon, quiet evenings by the fire. Loneliness sat with her like an old habit. There had once been a young man in the village, kind and hopeful, but life had taken him elsewhere. Honoria did not blame him. Love was a luxury she could not afford. She folded that dream away and returned to her needle. The night everything changed came with thunder. Rain fell hard and fast, beating against the windows and drowning out every other sound. Honoria had already changed into her nightclothes and banked the fire when the knock came. It was not frantic. It was not weak. It was firm, controlled, and tired. She froze. A woman alone did not answer doors at night, not on a storm like this. The village was far. No one would hear her scream. Her hand tightened around the iron poker, but something in the knock made her hesitate. It sounded patient, almost respectful. She lit a candle and opened the door just enough to look. Lightning cut the sky, and in its sharp white light she saw him. The stranger was tall and broad-shouldered, soaked through, his dark riding coat heavy with rain. A horse stood behind him, shifting and steaming in the cold. His face was half hidden beneath his hat, but his voice was calm and low, carrying an authority she did not expect. He said he needed shelter. His horse had lost a shoe miles back, and the storm had made the road impossible. He offered payment. Honoria studied him in silence. His clothes were fine, his posture trained. He was not a common traveler. Every sensible thought told her to refuse, to send him on toward the village. But the rain was merciless, and the horse trembled with exhaustion. Something in the man's stillness made her step aside. She let him in. The cottage seemed smaller with him inside. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair plastered to his brow and sharp features set in a face unused to smiling. He stood awkwardly, as though unsure how to exist in such a modest space. Honoria took his coat to hang by the fire, and that was when she saw the tear along the shoulder seam. The fabric had split cleanly, the lining exposed. It was a fine coat, beautiful work, ruined by chance. She made tea and brought out her sewing basket. The tools inside had belonged to her mother. Without a word, she chose a thread that matched the dark blue wool exactly and began to mend. The stranger watched her. She felt his gaze but did not look up. Her hands moved as they always did, small, careful stitches, closing the seam without puckering the cloth. The storm raged outside, thunder rolling like distant cannon fire, but inside the room there was only the fire, the needle, and the quiet rhythm of her work. He spoke once, thanking her. She answered briefly. She did not ask his name. She did not offer hers. Names meant little. Actions told more. When she finished, the repair was invisible. The coat was stronger than before. The man sat by the fire and drank his tea. At some point, exhaustion claimed him. His head fell back against the chair and his breathing deepened into sleep. Honoria watched him for a moment, unsettled by how peaceful he looked in rest. Then she wedged a chair under her bedroom door and slept lightly, listening to the storm fade into silence. By morning, he was gone. The fire was low, the coat gone with him. On the chair where he had slept sat a small leather purse. Inside were gold coins, more money than Honoria had ever held at once. No note, no explanation. She stared at them, then tucked the purse into her sewing basket and went on with her day. Life did not pause for mysteries. Work still waited. The garden still needed tending. She told herself the stranger was nothing more than a passing moment. The next afternoon proved her wrong. She was hanging linens in the garden when she heard hooves. Not one horse, many. The sound grew louder, heavier, until the ground itself seemed to shake. Honoria turned, shading her eyes, and her heart stopped. A column of guards rode toward her cottage, their uniforms bright and precise, their formation flawless. There were 50 of them, at least. At their head rode an officer whose bearing spoke of power and command. They halted at her gate as one. The officer dismounted and approached, his steps measured. Honoria stood frozen, dirt on her hands, hair escaping its pins. He spoke her name. She answered because there was nothing else she could do. He handed her a sealed letter and said that His Grace, the Duke of Thornbury, requested her presence at his estate. A carriage waited. She might bring what she required. Honoria thought she had misheard. Dukes did not summon seamstresses. Guards did not fill her garden. Her knees weakened, but she held herself upright. She said there must be a mistake. She did not know any duke. The officer replied calmly that His Grace had not forgotten the kindness shown to him during the storm. He wished to offer her employment. Understanding struck like lightning. The stranger, the coat, the gold. He had been a duke. The world tilted. She had given tea to a duke, spoken to him plainly, mended his coat without knowing his name. Every sensible instinct screamed at her to refuse. But beneath the fear stirred something else. Curiosity. Possibility. A door she had never known existed stood open before her. She asked for an hour to pack. The officer agreed. Honoria moved through her cottage as if in a dream. She packed her best dress, her mother's earrings, her sewing basket. She locked the door and placed the key in her pocket, unsure if she would ever return. The carriage carried her away from the only life she had known, toward a future she could not imagine. And somewhere beyond the hills, a man who had slept by her fire waited to see if she would come. The carriage rolled through the countryside for hours, its wheels steady against the long road, but Honoria felt every mile as if it were pulling her farther from herself. She watched fields give way to rising hills, modest farms replaced by wide estates with iron gates and ancient trees. The farther they traveled, the quieter she became. Her thoughts tangled between fear and wonder. She had lived her whole life within a narrow circle, and now that circle was breaking open. When Ashford Hall finally came into view, it stole the breath from her lungs. The house rose from the land like something unreal, built of warm stone that caught the light of the setting sun. Windows stretched in long rows, more than she could count, and towers marked the corners like silent guards. The ground spread endlessly, trimmed gardens melting into open parkland where deer moved like shadows. This was not a home. It was a world. The carriage stopped before a wide staircase. Footmen hurried forward, opening the door, helping her down as though she belonged there. Honoria clutched her small bag, painfully aware of her plain dress and worn shoes. A woman descended the steps to meet her. She was tall and severe, dressed in black silk, her silver hair pinned with precision. Her eyes were sharp, dark, and assessing. She introduced herself as the Dowager Duchess of Thornbury. Her tone was polite but cool, and she did not smile. She told Honoria to follow her. and turned without waiting for a reply. Honoria obeyed, her heart pounding as she stepped into the vast entrance hall. Portraits lined the walls, generations of faces staring down at her as if questioning her right to be there. They walked through corridors filled with quiet grandeur until they reached a set of tall doors. The dowager told her that her son awaited her inside. Then she left Honoria alone. The library was immense. Books rose toward the ceiling in towering shelves, ladders fixed to rails, balconies circling the upper levels. A great fire burned at the far end of the room, throwing warm light across leather chairs and polished wood. A man stood before the fire with his back to her. When he turned, Honoria recognized him at once. The stranger from the storm stood before her, clean and composed, his dark hair neatly arranged, his coat perfectly fitted. Yet his eyes were the same storm gray, and when they met hers, something unguarded passed between them. He thanked her for coming. She addressed him formally, unsure how else to speak to a duke. He asked her not to. He told her his name was Cassius, and though the request felt improper, it felt honest. He spoke then of that night, of how she had asked nothing, of how her silence had struck him harder than any praise or fear. He told her how long it had been since anyone had treated him as simply a man. He explained the scandal that had driven him from society, the broken engagement, the betrayal, the years of isolation. He spoke without drama, but the pain beneath his words was clear. Honoria listened, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She understood loneliness. She understood loss. Though their worlds were different, their wounds were not. Cassius offered her a position as his personal seamstress. He promised fair pay, comfort, and freedom. He told her she could leave if she wished. He would not force her. Honoria asked for honesty. Respect. Time to herself. She told him she would not bow or pretend to be smaller than she was. To her surprise, he smiled. She agreed to stay. Her rooms were finer than anything she had known. Soft bed linens, a sitting room with a view of the gardens, a wardrobe larger than her entire cottage. The housekeeper explained that she was to be treated as a guest, not a servant. Still, she felt out of place. The days that followed were strange and careful. The staff watched her, uncertain how to treat a woman who did not fit their rules. Honoria worked quietly, mending coats and shirts of the finest make. She walked the gardens alone. She read in the library. She learned the rhythms of the house. Cassius kept his distance at first. When they spoke, it was polite, measured. But slowly, without plan or promise, they began to talk more. He visited her workroom in the evenings. They spoke of books, of childhood, of things they had loved and lost. He listened to her stories of her parents, of her small cottage, of the life she had built alone. Something grew between them, something neither named. The dowager watched it all with cold attention. One afternoon, she summoned Honoria to her sitting room. The questions were sharp. Why was she here? What did she want? Honoria answered honestly. She told her she had not sought this life. She had only offered kindness. She had expected nothing. The dowager warned her plainly. If Honoria proved false, she would be destroyed. Honoria accepted the warning without flinching. Winter settled over Ashford Hall. Frost glazed the gardens. Snow softened the land. The house felt quieter, more enclosed, and within that stillness, Cassius and Honoria grew closer. He showed her the observatory. They stood beneath stars and spoke of the vastness beyond their pain. Then the past returned. Lady Sybil Drummond came back to England. Her name alone changed Cassius. He withdrew, closed himself away. Old wounds reopened. Honoria felt the distance and feared it. The dowager summoned them both and spoke of Lady Sybil's wish to visit. She spoke of apology, of reconciliation, of society watching closely. Cassius refused. He wanted nothing from his former fiancée. The dowager pressed him. Lady Sybil still held influence. Where do you come to? She could harm him again or help restore his name. When the dowager left them alone, Cassius finally spoke the truth he had been holding back. He told Honoria he was tired of hiding, tired of being alone. He admitted that what he felt for her frightened him because it was real. He asked her what they were to each other. Honoria answered honestly. She did not promise certainty. She promised truth. Cassius took her hands and told her he was falling in love with her. Had been, since the night she opened her door without knowing who he was. She told him she felt it too. They stood together, fragile and brave, knowing the world would not be kind to them. Lady Sybil arrived weeks later, dressed in grace and regret. She wept. She begged. She painted herself as changed. Cassius refused her. When she left, shaken and furious, he went to Honoria and held her as if afraid to let go. He told her Lady Sybil had insulted her, dismissed her as nothing. Cassius answered by asking Honoria to marry him. The question came suddenly, fiercely. He knew it would bring trouble. His mother's doubt, society's cruelty, Lady Sybil's anger. Honoria thought of her quiet cottage, of her mother's voice, of the storm that had changed everything. She said yes, but even as they embraced, unseen forces were already moving, and Lady Sybil was not finished. The days after the engagement felt unreal, as if Honoria were living inside a story someone else had written. Word spread quickly through Ashford Hall. Some servants smiled at her with open approval. Others watched with guarded curiosity. The Dowager Duchess said little at first, observing in silence, weighing every glance and gesture. When Cassius finally told his mother of his intention to marry Honoria, the moment stretched long and heavy. The dowager did not shout or weep. She only studied Honoria with that sharp, unreadable gaze. She asked one question. Did Honoria love her son? Honoria answered without hesitation. She said yes. The dowager nodded once. She warned them both that the world would not be kind, that society would cut and whisper, that enemies would look for weakness. But she also said she would not stand against her son's happiness again. It was not warmth, but it was permission. Lady Sybil did not accept defeat quietly. Rumors began to surface in London drawing rooms. Stories twisted and grew. Honoria was painted as a schemer, a woman who had trapped a duke with false innocence. Cassius ignored it all until a letter arrived bearing a seal he knew too well. It was from Percival Harrogate, the man who had once betrayed him with Lady Sybil. The letter was addressed to Honoria. Cassius found it unopened on her desk and insisted she read it aloud. Harrogate claimed to possess proof of a plan Lady Sybil was preparing. Forged letters, false evidence. A public scandal meant to destroy the engagement. He offered the truth in exchange for nothing but acknowledgement. Honoria felt the trap immediately, but she also felt the danger. She chose honesty. She went to Cassius at once and told him everything. Together, they decided to face it directly. Harrogate's information proved true. Lady Sybil had hired a forger to create letters meant to show Honoria as unfaithful. The exposure was arranged carefully. At a grand winter gathering filled with witnesses, Cassius presented proof before Lady Sybil could act. The truth shattered her lies. Gasps filled the room as the forger's confession was read. Lady Sybil's composure broke. Her reputation collapsed in a single night, and she fled society in disgrace. The danger passed, leaving exhaustion in its wake. The wedding took place on a cold morning bright with winter sun. The chapel at Ashford Hall filled with light and quiet wonder. Honoria walked forward with steady steps, her mother's earrings at her ears, her hands calm. When the question of objection was asked, the Dowager Duchess stepped forward and spoke clearly. She declared her full support of the marriage and welcomed Honoria into the family. That moment silenced every doubt. Honoria Ashworth became the Duchess of Thornbury. Life after the wedding was not simple, but it was true. Society learned to accept her dignity. Those who whispered eventually grew tired. Those who mattered saw her kindness and strength. Honoria never abandoned her needle. She taught sewing to the daughters of servants. She kept her cottage and visited it often, tending the garden where her parents once stood. Cassius changed too. He laughed more. Trusted again. The man who once hid from the world now walked beside her openly. Years later, they would sit together by the fire and speak of the storm, the torn coat, the silence that began it all. Honoria understood then what she had always known in her bones. Kindness given freely is never lost. It only waits to return.